Hey, everybody. I remember the intro this time. Welcome to Religion Love. We are here to debate, explore, and review topics about religion, science, history, and current events. How are you doing, Joe?
Hey, doing good, AJ. How's your day
We're
going?
back.
Yeah, we're back. We're
Pretty
back. It's
good.
been a while for me, but I'm excited for this show, so I'm happy to be here. We got a great guest that's going to be on. It's going to be some interesting conversation. I'm just ready to see where it goes and jump in.
Yeah, me too. Me too. We have a really good topic today. We are going to talk about consciousness. I would say it's like one of these most intimate things that we have. It's like we are aware that we exist, right? Like we have this sort of inner narrator that we call the self. We feel that we are someone rather than just something. It's an experience that we can't step outside of, even if we tried. You can't be conscious that you're not conscious, right? So, because of that, this concept has been always surrounded with mystery. And for most of human history, whenever we encounter something mysterious like this, we do whatever humans do best, right? We fill the gaps with stories. We attributed consciousness to gods, to souls, to spirits, cosmic forces, or even some people to the universe itself. And it's not because we're foolish. Well, maybe for some, could be, right? But it's because we're trying to make sense of the one phenomenon that we haven't quite been able to measure or predict or fully explain. We have definitions for it, but we don't have an explanation for it. And when you don't know how the mind works, the supernatural can feel like the only language that we can have to describe it. But today, in the age of neuroscience, cognitive science, human biology, animal biology, philosophy of mind, skepticism, we have a lot more tools to ask better questions, to get better answers, and we are able to see the human mind not just as this supernatural exception, but rather a natural part of the universe that we live in. And it's not to say that consciousness is part of the universe, just like it's, you know, we live in the universe. But, anyways, consciousness is something that emerges, evolves, and interacts with the world in ways that we are just beginning to uncover. And the beauty of a secular perspective on consciousness is that it doesn't diminish the mystery because we are still really, really curious about it. And it allows us to explore it outside of the supernatural views that other people have. And we can look at the brain and say, hey, isn't this really incredible? Isn't like the fact that billions of neurons can create this sense of being? And, you know, what can you do? So today we are going to talk about consciousness with that curiosity, and we are joined by someone that has a lot to say about consciousness. Richard, how are you doing, Richard Gilliver?
I'm very, very well. Thank you for having me. I always enjoy being on, and I always enjoy talking to you and Joseph because it's kind of we get deep into the weeds with stuff, but it's not like most people will know me from the call-in shows and stuff. This is a completely different avenue to that. It's like chatting with friends. So it's like having a good wait. It's chatting with friends. It's not
It
like
is. It
chatting
is.
with friends. It is chatting with friends, and so it's a completely different environment. So and on the calling shows, I don't talk about consciousness and philosophy anywhere near as much as I would like to do. So it's great to come and talk about the things I'm passionate about and just sit around and do it with friends and be able to get into the weeds with it.
I love it too. Yeah, I really enjoy having you over because I think pretty much every time you've been on, we have discussed consciousness. It's such an
Yeah,
interesting
sorry
topic.
about that. I'm a one trick pony,
Oh
unfortunately.
no, 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 no! I
Your
love it
knowledge, yeah, your
because
knowledge is great.
Yeah, because I'm really interested in the brain, and so for me to see the perspective that theology brings to say, oh, consciousness comes from God, and I'm over here like the brain. Let's talk about the brain part. So you are writing a book. Is it about consciousness or philosophy? It's philosophy.
It's got a bit of both, and it's about. It's hard to categorize. I always say it's about epistemology. It's about why we believe what we believe, essentially, and guarding against the way that our mind plays tricks on us. There's going to be two case studies in there. One is a friend of mine went to see a psychic and
Mhm,
recorded it. And I should
mhm,
say that, shouldn't I? Psychic, and recorded it, and very, very kindly let me transcribe it and use it for the book. So this is a real time analysis of someone talking to someone who proclaims to be a psychic medium, and
mhm,
it's what it's going to be is basically I'm going to break down the entire conversation, show where there's cold reading taking place, hot reading taking place, where the person could have found this information out on social media beforehand, that they had full access to my friend's name, address, social media, they'd been in contact on social media. Uh, so it's going to be a breakdown of, if we're looking at this through the eyes of a believer, if we believe in psychics, look at these other possibilities. Look at what might be going on here. Look at where uh, things are happening where our brain, as the person who's seeing the psychic, could be making mistakes and giving unconscious clues. Look at the way that the person who proclaims to be a psychic is uh, either consciously or unconsciously manipulating the conversation, and all those things, and it's going to break it down. And the other case study in there is applying psychology to the resurrection accounts of Jesus.
mhm,
So it's going to go into, briefly, it's going to go into this kind of idea that, the gospel accounts aren't actually eyewitness accounts, blah blah blah. But for the sake of argument, it's going to accept that the gospel accounts are actually writing about eyewitness accounts, and it's going to break it down from the psychological perspective. And it shows that every single aspect of the gospel accounts, when they're talking about the resurrection of Jesus, every single aspect can actually be accounted for by known psychological phenomena. And it's going to go into that and break all that down. But they're the case studies. It's also going to talk about how we get tricked by social media, how we get tricked by spam, how we get tricked by things like propaganda, and where we're reading things like there was a big think about TikTok might be banned in America
mhm,
last year or a couple of years ago, and it's going to go into a bit of the stuff behind that and how people manipulate things to try and push an agenda on social media. So it's a whole range of stuff. The first chapter of the book talks about philosophy. The first two chapters set up the rest of the book, and they say, look, in the first chapter we talk about philosophy, we talk about the universe. So we talk about, there's lots of different ways to assess what reality might be, but hopefully by the end of this book you can agree with me that what I'm suggesting is the best way to analyze what reality possibly is. So it's going to talk about philosophy, different philosophical ideas in the first chapter. It's going to talk about what the universe is and give some great little experiments. There's some brilliant experiments in there where you can actually work things out for yourself, because there's
Right.
nothing worse than reading something dry and
mhm,
intellectual. And, I've talked to AJ before about this great, great, great neuroscientist called Antonio Damasio, whose
mhm.
books are boring as fuck. They really, really are dry. It's brilliant. The subject matter is brilliant, but they are a slog to get through. And there's nothing worse than reading a book which has got complicated ideas in, where it's dry and it's a chore to get through. So what I try and do in this with big concepts, big ideas like the universe, I try and give little experiments. So to for example, to kind of gather what the speed of light actually means.
Mm-hmm.
I put it in the framework of driving at 55 miles in a car, 55 miles an hour in a car, and how long in time it would take to cover the same amount of time at distance that light travels in a second, in a minute, in a year.
Oh,
So you go into it yourself, you do the work yourself.
Yeah, I like that because it lets you conceptualize like exactly what you're trying to explain, so you have a better idea to actually see it yourself. I like that.
Absolutely. And with the universe, it's so easy. I think we've been exposed that much. I'm an old man, and I've always been interested in the science of the universe since as far back as I can remember. And I think it's very, very easy to kind of get this idea of the universe is 13.8 billion years old. And we kind of just we make it smaller so we can accept it. We make it manageable so we can accept it, these big numbers that we're given. And I think a lot of the time we don't stop to think about what it actually means.
like compare it to something else
Yeah,
that
we
we
need.
can understand better.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. As Joseph said, to conceptualize it, to really, really grasp it, what it means. So that's what the first chapter does with philosophy and with the universe. And the second chapter, which is going to be my favorite chapter of the book, goes in to consciousness. It goes
Okay.
into how the brain works. It goes into psychology. That's my chapter. That's the chapter I'm writing for myself. And
Awesome.
it goes into consciousness, it goes into psychology, it goes into how the brain works, it goes into how the brain makes mistakes, and all that good stuff, which we're probably going to touch a lot upon today while we're having
Oh
this
yeah.
conversation. And what it does is it takes the first chapter, as you saw, these principles you've learned about philosophy and logic and the universe, which is reality. And it takes the second chapter, which is how we assess our little bubble of that reality and interpret that bubble of reality. And it puts them together and it says, look, now we have a framework by which to assess claims as possibly true. And it uses that framework throughout the rest of the book. It harkens back to what we've learned in those first two chapters. And it says, right, now let's apply it. Let's apply it to these ideas of things like Jesus' resurrection, about psychics, about con men. Let's apply it to all those things and see what it tells us about the world we live in.
That's amazing. I can't wait to read that because I mean, it sounds like it covers a whole lot of different topics that are sort of related to each other in how do we come to believe what we believe, based on consciousness, on epistemology, on philosophy. So I'm really excited to go to the UK and pick up my signed copy one day.
Absolutely.
What's the timeline? What's the timeline? Do you have one or
No,
okay?
no. I've almost finished the first chapter.
Okay.
I've almost finished the first draft of the first chapter, and I think at the moment there are 10 chapters. That might expand a little depending on how excited I get about talking about consciousness, because I could probably write a whole book just on consciousness. So that's the hard part, is condensing stuff. So I've got a little bit left in the first chapter to write about quantum physics. It's time. It's simply time, because I'm not just writing that book. I'm writing another book, which is just a religious studies book. It's nothing where I work with religious people
Mhm.
and talk about the history of religion in a particular area of Britain. And I'm also working full time, and I'm also doing a degree, and I've got a family. So it's
Busy,
it's
busy,
fitting
busy.
everything together. So I tend to go through kind of bursts of writing, like intensely writing, and then I'll have a couple of months where I'm doing something else. Then I'll jump back in, and so yeah, I have no time frame. I first talked about this book to about 4 years ago,
Oh wow. Okay.
I've only been writing it for probably going on a year properly, like really investing in it. So it's coming along, but all the infrastructure's there now. That was the hard part, getting the infrastructure there. I was very lucky that I've got a friend who you may know, Dr. Richard Godby here, who wrote A Human
Oh, yeah.
History of Emotion and is one of the non-profits over on the ACA. He very, very kindly sent me. He's written a best-selling book, and it really helps when you're writing a book to know someone who's already written a best-selling book. And actually, also Dr. Dean Burnett, who's another neuroscientist, he wrote a book on emotion called Emotional Ignorance. And Richard informed a lot of his work as well. I've spoken to Dean. I've interviewed Dean before for my channel, and Dean reached out to Richard. He's a friend of Richard's, and he reached out to him and asked, for advice from Richard writing his book. And I've reached out to Richard, said, "Can you give me any tips?" He was really, really helpful. He said, "Look, this is a template I'm doing. Don't show anybody because this is the second book I'm writing, and I don't want anybody to see it or know anything about it." But he sent me this great, great template, which included lots and lots of stuff I'd not even thought about. So that really, really, really helped put an infrastructure in place for me to turn this thing that I'd been talking about at that time for about 2.5 years. I'm going to write this book, and never
Wow.
actually done anything. That gave me the kind of get up and go to and say, right, like put pen to paper and actually start doing it. And so that was really, really helpful. And it's one of the greatest things I've ever set out on doing. I love doing it. When I get the time to do it, I get in my own little zone. These go on with some spacey new age music because that's my work music, and I sit down and I just start writing, and it just comes out. The hardest part, as with writing essays and things like that when you're at university, the hardest part is remembering to source everything. Because as you know, you've had me on your channel many, many times. We've talked about consciousness virtually every time I've been on it. And once I get into the flow of talking about something, I can just go on. I can just keep going and going and going and going. So it's really hard to discipline yourself when you're like that, when you've got that personality. It's really hard to discipline yourself and say, right, I really need to make sure I'm using the right references for this. I'm using the right source material. I'm fact checking every single thing I say, because I don't want to write a book about epistemology and be telling people incorrect information.
Right.
I want to
Right.
make sure I fact check I'm quite good at fact checking. I self fact check all the time anyway, so I'm quite good at doing that. So it's just the case of doing it on paper and going out and getting the material, and it's very time consuming, but yeah, it's a great process. I love it.
Well, now I know where to go when I'm writing my book. One day.
Yeah, Dr.
It'll
Richard
happen.
Godby
It'll
here.
happen. Well, I was gonna go to you,
I
but
think she
okay.
was going to say you.
I'll step over there. Okay, there was a funny comment on here. Somebody's asking for you to say that quote. It isn't in the tin, in your accent.
Ascalon is a good friend of mine. Ascalon, it's in Tintin. First of all, let's get it out of the way. It's in Tintin. But I've met Ascalon in real life, and I've met a few people who I first met on the internet in real life. Ascalon is possibly the most visually like he is on the internet in real life person I've met. It's just like, that's him. Yeah, there was no doubting who it was. It was like, that's him. I know that guy. And when I first met him, he's gonna kill me for saying this. He doesn't like hugging people. He's really averse to hugging people and physical contact. So I said to my daughter, I was with my daughter when we met him. I think she was 8 at the time, and I said, as soon as you meet him, as soon as you see him, I'll point him out, and the first thing I want you to do is run up to him and give him the biggest hug. So She did, and it looked very, very uncomfortable. But yeah, it's a great friend. I love Ascalon. We've known each other a couple of years now, and had a lot of fun together. So yeah,
That's funny. I mean, you can't say no to the children. If the
you
children go
can't
for a
say no.
hug,
I
You
don't
gotta
think I
give
had
it
a
to him.
choice.
that's so funny. So he's in England as well. That's nice.
No, we were actually in Scotland at the time, so
Oh, okay, okay.
yeah, don't
So,
confuse Britain with England.
Yeah,
oh, my bad.
don't do that.
My bad.
Don't do
I, w-
that.
I mean, I almost said Wales.
Yeah, well, some people do say that. Some people, there's a nasty rumor going round, which was started by Dr. Ben, I believe, that I am in fact
Yes.
Welsh. It is not true. I am not a Welsh
We,
person. It's funny because one of a great supporter of mine, who's followed me for a couple of years online, she is from Wales. And when this comes up and I kind of protest about, well, I'm not Welsh, I'm not Welsh, she kind of always makes a little comment about, there's nothing wrong with Wales, what are you talking about? So there's nothing wrong with Wales, I'm just not Welsh.
why? Yeah, I mean, that's like if I am from Argentina, and a lot of people mistakenly, because I speak Spanish, will be like, "Are you from Mexico?" And I'm like, completely different continents,
Yeah,
even.
yeah, yeah. People do make those mistakes, and some people you can forgive for doing it, other people not so
You
much.
can't.
Other people need a poke in the eye, but we'll leave that one.
All right, let's get started on this topic. And clarify for me, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I remember that the theory of consciousness that you most line up with will be physicalism, materialism. Are they're similar?
Uh, I don't. We'll get into this a little bit later on the philosophy
Okay.
stuff. I don't particularly align with any specific theory of consciousness. I don't think. I mean, physicalism isn't itself a theory of consciousness. Theory of consciousness.
Hmm.
There's integration theory of consciousness and things like that. I try and stay away from labeling myself into anything because I think it's even atheist, I don't call myself an atheist. I don't walk around the street thinking to myself, I am an atheist. I use it when it's useful to use it when I'm talking to someone, when we're having these conversations online and it comes up. I'm not a labels kind of person. And I think while it's useful to understand what the different theories are, I try not to say that I align with any of them because I think there's nuance in everything. And where a new piece of information can come up, I think it can, and it might be a minute piece of information. It can change the way you think about a subject drastically. And I try and keep myself open so that I'm not applying either for myself or for other people. I don't want to misrepresent what I think on something. So it's very important to me not to kind of strictly align myself with any kind of theory or ideas. Or I really like, as I mean, we've spoken privately, AJ, because you're really into the mind and consciousness and stuff. I
Hmm.
really like Antonio Damasio's way of looking at consciousness, about it being kind of feelings and forms of pictures that we come up with. And but I wouldn't say I'm 100% a supporter of that idea, because I think there's lots of different things. Consciousness, I think we have to separate it. I think people do separate it, and I think it's a mistake to separate it into human consciousness and like non-human consciousness as a separate category. And I don't think it is.
We'll
I
get
th-
into that later. We're gonna get
yeah.
into that. I
Okay. Go
have,
on. Go on.
yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, I've never thought of it looking at it that way. You are right though. That's going to be interesting to talk about.
No, I appreciate what you were just saying, because I feel that with consciousness specifically, we we know we have a definition for it. Like I said earlier, we don't have an explanation yet that is 100% nailed down. And
Yeah.
so if we close our mind to being like, oh, okay, this is the one label that I'm gonna take, and that's that, then we are doing a disservice to ourselves and to the curiosity of continuing to learn about what exactly is consciousness. So, what are some of the silliest ideas about consciousness that you've heard so far? I have a couple
Uh,
listed that I was looking into, and I was like, oh,
okay,
it's cool.
so not going into theories specifically, because as I said earlier, there's integrated information
Yeah.
theory, global workspace theory, higher order theories, predictive coding theories, and all these other wonderful, wonderful ideas about consciousness. I think I saw on Threads earlier today. I was perusing Threads as I often do, and someone just put a message on from their friend who'd taken LSD for the first time, and come up with this idea that our being conscious is the universe being conscious and the universe observing itself. That for me is probably the silliest, the silliest serious suggestion, and it is something that is considered. I think it ignores too much stuff. It ignores too many things. It's poetic and it's nice, and in a way it's true, but it's not true in that I've just had LSD way, and it's not true in that the universe is actually conscious and observing itself. In a nice poetic metaphoric way, it's kind of true that our being conscious and other creatures being conscious is the universe manifesting consciousness. But we've got to be very, very careful not to confuse that with saying that the universe is conscious, because that's a very, very different thing.
Right, that would mean the universe being aware that it is the universe and being aware that humans are humans and the planets are planets and all of that stuff. So yeah, that's funny because that's the one I had at the top of my list. It was it's called cosmopsychism. Cosmopsychism.
Mm.
That's the name for it. Anyways, and the next one was idealism, which is more like it's kind of like simulation theory, that an idea that reality is like mentally based, like that we are sort of hallucinating reality. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but that's the one that I was like, okay, that's the second one that's also silly, but it seems to have more traction than the one where people are like, oh, the universe is conscious.
Yeah, there's a. If I can find it, I'm just gonna. I'll rabbit on about that in the background a little bit, but there's a great quote that's actually in the book I'm writing
Okay.
regarding that, and it's from, if I can't remember who it's from, let me try and find the section. But yeah, this idea of a simulation theory is a thing. It's an actual thing that people have come up with, and it's gained popularity and kind of linked a lot to this idea of the Matrix, the movie The Matrix, and there were different ones, different simulation theories. They're not all kind of Matrix based, if you like. But yeah, that's essentially what it is. I'm trying to find this quote, so I don't know if you want to chat a little bit and say a little bit about your understanding, so I'm not just gobstopping while I find this quote.
No, you're good. Ascalon says, I've heard similar that something like evolution is the universe learning.
Yeah.
Have you heard of consciousness, where they say that it's basically a concept of the mind? You would say a biological, maybe survival trick, uh, basically, so the humans can simulate internally like the outcome of their action before actually doing it to stay alive, to have a better outcome. Does that make sense? I don't know.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm also not quite
Following
like
that.
Yeah,
kind of
I'm not
like
tracking entirely, because there is this, it is an evolutionary. There are evolutionary kind of theories of consciousness as well that talk about how the mind and consciousness has come to be, and some of them are very much. There have been studies done where we find this idea. I'm just going to abandon looking for that because it's taking forever and stopping me talking. So people aren't here to me for me to look for a particular quote. I'll give you the gist of the quote in a minute. So essentially, yeah, this idea that the human mind is kind of formed in such a way that it makes decisions before we're conscious of these decisions being made. And there've been a number of tests. It was made famous in the 90s. I think it was the 90s by a particular study. And it's not a very good study, but it's leads into a good framework of studies that actually talk about this. So regarding evolution, yeah, the evolution itself, I don't know if this is what you were getting at, Joseph, but evolution itself does lead in. There is a whole field that talks about the evolution of mind and evolution of consciousness, and it is really, really interesting. The quote, as I said, I've not found it. I've abandoned looking for it, but it basically said it was from somebody who did computer models of kind of synthetic things. So someone really, really kind of qualified to talk about simulations. That is his profession. And it basically said that a simulated universe is impossible based on the work we have in simulations and that what we can do and what we can, like, we think we can do in the future. It is impossible to have a simulated universe. It's a really, really good quote. I'll when I do find it, I'll put it in the comments of the video so everyone can see it.
I appreciate that. Yeah, when you do that. Yeah, that's what this book that I'm reading, that I recommended to you, Journey of the Mind, is. It kind of goes into the evolutionary process of um, consciousness. We'll get to it in a little bit. I have some notes and questions to go on about that. Um, but for me, like, when speaking of, consciousness evolving, like whenever we discuss it, I can't help but think about babies. Right? And maybe I'm like completely wrong. um I don't know, maybe this isn't necessarily about consciousness, but looking at a freshly newborn baby, right, it appears to me that while they're obviously conscious, it must be a completely different kind of consciousness from what we adults experience. And even toddlers, right? Like they don't record memories until around school age or so. When you look at babies, like their vision, their hearing, their emotional regulation, their language are also underdeveloped and so limited at that age. Um, and I was reading this study recently that talk about the different stages of development that the brain goes through in one single person's life, right? I don't know if you heard about it. It indicated that adolescence doesn't end actually until around age 32 or so, which made me feel a lot younger now. So I appreciate that science. Thank you. I'm barely out of adolescence, I guess. But anyway, so previously we used to think of adolescence ending in our early 20s. And so anyway, all of that, thinking about babies, adolescents, the way that the brain develops at different stages, makes me wonder about the different ways that consciousness is experienced, even by our own species. So am I misunderstanding what consciousness is when I'm thinking about that? Is that just like
I think it's
experience
better
only?
to describe consciousness as something that does rather than is. Consciousness
Mm-hmm.
is something that happens. The the big kind of metaphor I use for it when this is specifically talking about the hard problem of consciousness, but the metaphor I use, but it applies to this as well, is that if you imagine consciousness as locomotion, so it's not something that is, Like the brain is something that is, and in the metaphor I use the car, a car as the is, which is the
Mhm.
brain. But the consciousness itself is it's an action. It's something that is doing. So
Okay.
like when a car is moving, it's doing something. It's something in action, and I think that's the same as consciousness. Consciousness isn't a thing that is static, which we can say this is a thing called consciousness. Consciousness is a process,
Mhm.
and I think it's a very helpful distinction because I think it really, really helps us to understand consciousness when people are talking about it. When we see, AJ sent me, I think was it yesterday. You sent me a great little
Oh, the
video
video.
with
Yeah.
Brian Cox hosting, and it had kind of the 4 people who were in neuroscience and a philosopher on it, or 3 people who were neuroscientists and psychologists, and one who was a philosopher, and on the panel. And when you're listening to things like that, when you're listening to the people who do this professionally, do this for a living, all those neuroscientists, all those psychologists were people who worked in different areas where consciousness is something that they study on a daily basis. It's part of their work. And when you're listening to people and being informed, when you think of this idea as consciousness as something that is done rather than something that is, then I think it's a lot easier to grasp the ideas of the professionals when they're talking about it. And that's the way I always try and think of consciousness. And I really like what you said about babies, AJ. And one of the things I try and put across to people when we're talking about different kind of phases of consciousness in humans and consciousness in other creatures, because there are creatures that are conscious but not aware, or they have mind but they're not self-aware. And it's actually easier to imagine what's that like than it might first appear, because we are in that stage when we are asleep every day. Our brains
Mhm.
work, our brains are still
Mm.
working, our minds are still working, our consciousness is still a thing. Even though we are unconscious, we still have the capacity for consciousness. But unless we're dreaming, when we're not in the dreaming states, when we're in deep sleep, we're not actually aware of, we are not conscious. We are unconscious, but our
Mhm.
minds are still working. The thing that produces consciousness is still
Yeah.
there. It's still fully working. So I think that's a really, really, really good kind of way to try and imagine what some of these creatures that have minds, that have the ability for consciousness, but aren't self-aware, experience. It is, and it's that kind of, when we are asleep, when we are in deep sleep, our bodies still react to external stimuli. Our minds
Mm.
still react to external stimuli, but they're not self-conscious about it. They're not self-aware about it. And it's a really, really interesting phase when you're talking about babies, when you're talking about different stages of adolescence. All these things affect consciousness. The way, the way teenagers react. Teenagers aren't being intentionally rebellious when they're being rebellious. It's the chemicals in their body which are informing the way their brains are and the way their consciousness are, and ultimately the way their behavior is. So when you kind of trying to get a point across to a teenager and they aren't listening, it's not necessarily that they aren't listening to you. As if I'm having a conversation, I'm trying to put something across to AJ, and she just turns around and stops listening to me. It's not that that's happening. It's that they aren't capable of doing that, because that's not where their consciousness is at that time. That, because of the changes going through the bodies, that's not what, and it would be really helpful to be aware of this stuff. Dean Burnett, who I mentioned earlier, he is, you know, his best-selling book is The Idiot Brain, but he's wrote lots of books about, like, for both parents and teenagers to understand these ideas of what it's like to be a teenager and where it's at, where your brain's at, where your consciousness is at as a teenager, and as a parent, and how to deal with that. And as a teenager, how to deal with your parents when they're misunderstanding where you're at. So it's really, really interesting to note that consciousness does change. We are not just, I don't just have Richard consciousness throughout my life. My consciousness is changing throughout my life. The way I perceive things, the way I take things in. And, you know, as my body changes through time, so does my consciousness, because my consciousness is ultimately the thing that is doing when my body is. So as my body changes, what my consciousness does
Yeah.
changes with it.
That's a really great way to explain it. Yeah, I do have a whole video about the science of the teenage brain. So just in case people want to go check that out, because it does talk about the way teenagers connect with parents and how the changes in their brains and their hormones and all of because hormones affect your brain as well, right? Um, how all of that changes their focus and their motivations, and so the motivations become more so a little bit selfish, but it's a normal process of it of growing up, right? Because they want to go and drive and they want to go and have friends, and that's like the main thing that drives their behavior. And so that part about consciousness that you were talking about, how that shifts to a focus on the more so of being social rather than social with their peers, rather than being social with the people that raised them, whether it be the parents or whoever their caregiver was. So it's a really interesting way to look at the different stages and the different, like you say, your body changes, your consciousness level or the way your consciousness makes you behave is going to completely change. And yeah, I very much believe that there is different levels, or like you say, phases would be a
Yeah.
better word to call it, of consciousness.
And levels.
And yeah,
Just to complicate
so
things.
right,
Consciousness is a great thing for overcomplicating things. It's great.
Yeah, very,
right,
very.
exactly.
So this had me thinking about like the state of dream conscious. Well, the state of being in I guess dreaming. Like, can you be conscious or can you be self-aware in a dream? Like, can you
Yeah.
be? And because like where you react to something in a dream, you know,
Yeah.
you think you're falling and you wake up, you know, and you jump because you think you fell.
Yeah, this is actually a really, really interesting point to bring up. Dr. Richard Wiseman has done a lot of work on dream consciousness and stuff like that. I mean, Dr. Richard Wiseman's done a lot of great work anyway, but is just, I think he's really kind of foremost and leading kind of these studies behind the psychology of dreaming. And we have different conscious states in dreams as well. We have those states where we are dreaming and we're just kind of aware of what's happening but not in control of it. We have these states where called lucid dreaming, where you can get into a state that is where you can actually control your dreams. You're still asleep, you're not awake, but you have kind of this higher awareness than you would normally during dreams, so you can choose what to do in your dreams. You can choose, rather than being an observer of your dream happening as we are in normal dreaming, we can actually choose to turn left or turn right, or even do what we would normally call kind of miraculous things like fly and things like that. There's also these states where we wake up but our body is still locked, as if, because when we're dreaming, what happens is our brain releases chemicals which literally lock our bodies so we can't act out our dreams. Now, sometimes what happens is we wake up and we become fully conscious, but our bodies are still in this locked state. And this is one of the things which people propose are explanations for things like ghost sightings, succubus attacks, supernatural beings attacking us, alien abductions, all this stuff. It also creates a hyper awareness of sight and sound. So when you're in these states, you might see kind of shadowy beings, even though you're fully awake. You
That's
might see
considered.
shadowy beings in your room, or you. Sorry, go on.
No, I was gonna say that's like sleep paralysis, right? Where
That
you
is sleep
basically, yeah,
paralysis. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Where
so I
w-
was actually gonna bring that up because I just recorded a video for John, John the Skeptic, and so I was reviewing somebody else's video where this person was talking about demons, and he says that he had a sort of like a pornography obsession, addiction. I'm sorry. And so one day he was dreaming, and there was this woman that was like trying to get him to have sex with him and stuff. And so he said that he woke up and this woman, sort of like a 9 foot shadow, was standing in front of him and he couldn't move. And he immediately goes into it was a demon, and but it was Satan that brought me all these demons, but it only brought me closer to Jesus and stuff like that. And I was just there thinking, okay, no, what you just said, Richard, that's exactly what happens. Like when you go into REM sleep, your body paralyzes you, basically, right? To put a label on it, and so that your muscles cannot be moving. That's why sometimes when we're dreaming, our muscles twitch a little bit, attempting to um, recreate what you're dreaming, but it cannot fully do it because depending on the level of paralysis, you just can't complete the task of moving your muscles. And so, anyways, but because what happens is your brain is awake, half awake, not fully awake, but your body is not awake. That's what happens in sleep paralysis. And because your brain is also not fully awake, it's very common for people to still be dreaming while they are aware that they are awake. So it's like half asleep and half awake, and so you can see all of these shadows and things that you think are demons. I guess depending on whether you're religious or not, you may think it's a hallucination, but it is technically a hallucination. I guess because you're awake, we don't call it a dream anymore. We call it a hallucination. Uh, so yeah, it's a really really interesting uh, aspect of a way of exploring consciousness, like what happens when you're asleep. And you can also have a little bit of control. What is it called? Lucid dreaming, where
Lucid
people
dreaming. Yeah.
have, yeah, where
Yeah.
people have like, I did practice it when I was a teenager. I was like really fascinated by it. And so I would do the things that they recommend you do before you go to sleep, so that you could sort of be half awake and half aware that you're dreaming, that that's the dream, and that you can control the narrative of the dream. Sort of, it's not full control, but you can kind of be aware that you're dreaming.
Yeah, lucid dreaming, both lucid dreaming and sleep paralysis, being waking during sleep paralysis, are things that tend to start off in the teenagers' years as well. Now, I will caveat with what I'm about to say with I have not read any studies about this, particularly what I'm about to say. So this may all be bullshit. So please bear that in mind. This is just me putting two and two together, and possibly coming up with six. So bear that in mind. I would suggest that, and I'd love to see some studies done on this, that it is probably due to the chemical changes going off in your body, which kind of kickstart these things into action, and why we see them most often in teenagers, or certainly starting in the teenage years. They can carry on if you're someone who suffers particularly anxiety throughout your life and things like that. They can carry on into adulthood, but we predominantly see them in teenagers. Very rarely see them in very, very young children. And, they tend to phase out as you get older. I'd love to see the kind of a study done regarding the chemical changes going off in your body and in your brain, and the correlation to these things when they happen. As far as I'm aware, I've not seen any studies done of that sort yet. I don't know if there are any out there. I've certainly looked for some and not found them. So if they are out there, they're not at the forefront of things. They don't contain snazzy headlines, usually stuff like that. It's mundane studies tend not to kind of get a lot of attention, unfortunately. And
True.
sometimes the best stuff is found in them. We do get we have this problem in science where headline grabbing things tend to get more funding and more attention. It's unfortunate. Should it change? Probably, yeah. Will it change? Probably no. That's kind of just the way everything works.
Well, since we're on the topic of dreams and sleeping and so forth, I want to ask a question about people who sleepwalk. With someone who sleeps, when they're sleepwalking, they're not really conscious, but are they aware of the physical surroundings? Because I mean, they open doors, they open refrigerators, eat,
They
and
can
so
see.
forth.
Their body is processing the visual.
Yeah, if you're asking me, I'll hold my hands up. No idea.
Oh,
No, I don't.
I've done
Yeah.
nothing at all study wise on sleepwalking. So
I was just
it's
curious if you had any.
no,
any
it's a
knowledge
great
on that.
question. It
Yeah.
really is a great question, but I don't know. I just again wildly kind of just throwing it out there without any kind of anything at all to back this up. I suspect it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier when you have non-human and aware animals that aren't self-conscious.
Correct.
I suspect it's one of those kind of scenarios, but that's me speculating, and
Yeah.
I wouldn't want anyone to think that there's any science behind that statement whatsoever,
Well,
because there isn't.
I see the
No,
comparison though. I was thinking similar as well.
yeah, I only know a little bit about this and what I researched for that video that I was doing, and so it's kind of like similar to what we were just mentioning, right? In sleep paralysis, your body is still in sleep and your brain is waking up. So sleepwalking will be the opposite. It's like your brain is sleeping and your body is waking up, but your brain is never fully sleeping. So it can still, like, if you touch somebody that's sleeping, they are gonna feel that, right? And so it's the same thing, like your eyes are open, and so your brain is going to be processing what is coming through the eyeballs, right? And it's going to be processing the visual aspect of it, but you're not necessarily conscious in the way that you are when you're awake, that you can make decisions and
Yeah.
stuff,
So
but
they're not
you're
really. It's not really a conscious decision. It's more like a reflex
right.
or like a automatic reflex.
You're well, what will be the word, living your dream, like you're acting out your dream, you're acting out whatever you're dreaming
Got you.
about.
Yeah.
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 So yeah.
Yeah, you know what? This is why I love coming onto this show, because AJ's just mentioned just a phrase that has kind of prompted me to kind of take this conversation in a whole different
Okay,
direction. And
let's go.
when talking about the information coming in your eyes, and I think it's important, and it's a good point in the conversation to talk about how we actually assess things anyway, because this is really, really important, especially when we're talking about things like, a lot of people who are watching this probably now used to be the resident skeptic on a ghost hunting group. When we're talking about people being in unfamiliar places and seeing ghosts, it's really, really important to kind of know how it works. So what happens, how we interpret the world around us is, and I'd like, when I finish talking about this, I'd like to kind of get AJ's opinion on this, because AJ's, had surgery on eyes and on your hearing and stuff. Really, so it'd be interesting to kind of have a non-normative opinion of someone who, what I mean? So this is really interesting. How the brain works. I got into trouble off Jamie the Blind Limey, by the way, because I once made a statement saying 80% of the information that comes in to our brain and forms our image of the world comes through our eyes. And he just turned around and went, "Not mine, mate." But yeah, so in kind of normal functioning with human beings, the information comes into our sense organs through touch, sight, sound, taste, smell, that kind of stuff. And we don't see the world as it's often portrayed in films and stuff. We don't see it as like a video camera. So we form little snapshots of the world. We take little images of the world. And the majority of the image that we see out there is created from memory. It's not created from what's coming in. It's what we've experienced. And we've built up a model of the world, and then those snapshots of images that are coming in, of sounds that are coming in, of tastes that are coming in, and smells, what they do is they go to our brain and we cross-reference that inputting data with this model we've already built up from memory. And that's how we see things. So it's not like a continuous film. It's not like a continuous tape recording. It's cross-referencing all the time. Our brain is cross-referencing. That's why it makes so many mistakes. And when we're in somewhere which is unfamiliar, or if we're in somewhere we don't know very well, or where sensory information is limited, somewhere kind of like if we go to a strange location on a ghost hunt and all the lights are out because it's better to see ghosts in the dark for some bizarre reason. I have no idea why that is supposed to be. So automatically, what's happened when we're there is we've restricted the way we perceive the world from both the memory aspect, because we're in an unfamiliar location, and from the sensory input, because our environment is restricted. There's no lights and stuff on. So what our brain does is it fills in the blanks, and it takes the limited information it has and it fills in those blanks around us. And if you add that to you already believe in ghosts, or if you're in a ghost hunting group that's led by someone who is, let's say, trying to manipulate you, who you've paid to go on and they want you to see a ghost, and they're feeding you of stories of Lady Jane Grey, who lives in the room number 9 down the hallway, and we're going to do an investigation at midnight where we walk down the hallway with all the lights off and go into room number 9 in this strange location. All that combines. So you've been given this information, and you've got this limited sensory information coming in, and you've got this limited memory, and now you've got this information being fed into you. So your brain is going to fill that with the information you're being given. So if you see something, it is going more likely than not to take on the perception of that information which has been fed to your brain, because that and this is the really, really interesting part about it. People are genuinely seeing things. People are genuinely seeing things because that is the picture their brain is building from the information they've been given. So they're not actually seeing Lady Jane Grey in that room, that information that being fed. But for all intents and purposes, from their perspective, they are seeing Lady Jane Grey because that's what the information their brain has. And it's really, this is what's so fascinating about consciousness, that in a very, very real way, we do build the world around us that we see. We do have this, and we talked last time I was on the show about non-human animals and humans having this sensory species bubble called the umwelt, which is the species-specific bubble of how the world is perceived. So in a very, very real way, and this is why it's really important when we're talking to people who have or claim to have supernatural experiences, it's very, very important that we don't diminish that they've had an experience, because they have genuinely had an experience. What's important is that we try and get them to understand that the experience they've had is not necessarily specifically what they believe it to be, and there's a better way to assess that information. And I think that's really, really important, especially in the sphere we operate in as kind of content creators, where we're talking to believers in different things.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because for me personally, like you said, I had double corneal transplant and a cochlear implant, and so I always do wonder, like, obviously I am aware that my experience of the world may not be the same as others. So I can only compare it to my own experience of the world that I've experienced before having these surgeries, after having these surgeries. And one thing that I always like to talk about is the way that my thinking changed. So, to give a little background, I was during my early life up to my teenage years, I didn't even have hearing aids. The hearing aids were pretty useless. They helped some, but they did not provide the level of hearing that that I get now with the cochlear implant. And I got the implant in 2017, so it hasn't been that long. And I got the cornea transplants in 2022 and 23, I think, something along those lines. But so before all of this, as a kid, my vision was better than my hearing. So my thinking was very, very visual, right? Like I had a really vivid imagination. Things were very colorful. My memories were sort of like a video replay of things rather than static photos. Um, but over the years, like the last 15 years or so, my vision became worse and worse and worse. And then at some point, I was diagnosed as legally blind. And it was right around the time that I had my cochlear implant put in. And so now I could hear better, but I could see less. And without me even noticing, this is something that I've only recently became aware of, that my thinking became a voice, and mostly a voice. Now it's still mostly a voice, even though I have my vision back. And I imagine it's gonna take a while before, like maybe a couple of years before my thinking becomes more visual again. But I lost all that visual thinking, all that, I would say, not the creativity itself, but like before I could create images in my brain, and now I just, like, you describe something to me, I could draw it for you, but I can't put it in, or close my eyes and put it in my brain, right? And so I don't know. I haven't quite had any experiences since that I could be like that I could be comparing to past ones. But I did have a hearing experience once, and I always talk about this one when Joe's father passed away, and we were coming home from the funeral, and I walked into their house, and I didn't have my implant at the time, so my thinking was still very visual. And so I walk into the house and hear his dad telling me a phrase. Like it was his voice, his accent. I clearly heard the voice. And, for years, I always claimed it as the ghost, his soul spoke to me. But now, talking about having these conversations with atheists, with people who don't believe in ghosts and souls, and I'm like, well, clearly it was perhaps my brain making a connection with a memory of his voice and rehearing that. So, in a way, some kind of hallucination that happened while I was fully aware, fully awake, not not in any kind of um, altered state of mind other than like stress, right? But stress can
Can trigger that,
bring
yeah.
on, yeah. So I don't know if that helps you with any of what you're thinking about, like the way consciousness sort of adjusts itself for
Yeah,
my own experience.
absolutely, and that's why I wanted to kind of hear your perspective. Uh, a lot of the work that's been done in consciousness studies, I mentioned earlier Antonio Damasio. He was a neurosurgeon, and he's had patients and made case studies of patients in his books who have had brain surgery, and it's having brain surgery has completely changed their perception of the world around them. David Eagleman, I think it was David Eagleman in his book The Brain. I may be misremembering, which is another thing the brain does quite a lot. Dr. Julia Shaw is your person to go to for misremembering stuff. I told you I read a lot of this shit. David Eagle, I'm sure it's David Eagleman who talks about a case study in his brain where a guy sees for the first time after not seeing, and he literally has to relearn who his children are, because seeing them, getting that information in his brain visually changed his whole perception of his children, and he had to relearn who his children were. And I'm not sure if it's David Eagleman in the same book who talks about having there's a kind of simulation device that allows you to participate in having a different kind of visual experience. And it took him hours and hours and hours to learn how to walk just because he was seeing the world differently through this device. And it's so important to kind of take into account those perspectives of people who've had a change in consciousness because of a change in the physical makeup of eyes, brain, sound, all these experiences which change, in reality, change how our consciousness perceives. It is so important to consciousness studies. We would know nothing in consciousness studies if everyone was exactly the same and had the same brain state all the time. We are in the infancy of consciousness studies as it is, but we'd barely be out of the womb if we didn't have the ability to kind of look at different people with different interpretations. And it's so important. And even we were kind of mocking earlier this idea of the universe being conscious, but even ideas like that, it's important to at least take the perspective that people genuinely believe this seriously, so we can have as wide a field of scope as possible to talk about.
That's a very interesting thing that you described. Basically, how he had to relearn how he saw his children after he actually physically saw them, based how his brain perceived it. The brain's like so interesting, how it takes in everything and then puts that together to give you, I guess, a concept of how you think someone is seen in your view. Like me and AJ were eating at a restaurant a couple weeks ago, and I had some people sitting behind me that I couldn't see. I hadn't seen them the whole time, and I was listening to the whole conversation. We like to do that. We'll sit there and listen to other people's conversations. We're weird like that. But I visualized like a whole concept in my mind of how the guy looked, how the lady looked, based on the conversation, what they were talking about. Like, I saw him as a professor and so forth. And then when I actually saw them, it was like my mind had created something that was like completely like, they were nowhere close to what I had imagined in my mind.
That's actually really great. What we're talking about the book earlier and how I give kind of experiments in the book, and one of the experiments that I give is, and this is something I've done myself for self-reflection, and one of the kind of experiments I give is to sit in public, or when you're traveling on public transport or whatever, when you've got access to people you don't normally see, people you don't know. And if you see them wearing a t-shirt. Like I noticed, Joseph, you've got a Nirvana t-shirt on now. Yeah, so let's say you come across someone with a Nirvana t-shirt on. Don't do anything apart from observe yourself how you react to that. And it's such an interesting experiment. It tells you so much about your own consciousness and your own biases. When it might not be a Nirvana t-shirt, it might be a Donald Trump t-shirt. It might be a an ABBA t-shirt. It might be a Sex Pistols t-shirt. You know, never mind the bollocks. You know, a curse word. Wow, a curse word on a t-shirt. And just notice how you respond. And it's so amazing just how much this simple experiment, not taking into account anything apart from a t-shirt with a slogan on, can elicit in you emotional responses and you know, a whole array of neurons firing that kind of unleashes prejudice that you might have, that unleashes favoritism. If if you see someone with a Nirvana t-shirt and you're a Nirvana fan, you might how much you're biased towards that. See someone in, for example, if you don't like Donald Trump, and some people do, but let's remaining politically neutral. If you don't like Donald Trump, if you're one of those people, and you see that t-shirt had the feelings of resentment or hatred or whatever that conjures up, and just being self-aware. And it's such a simple experiment to do, but it reveals so much about your own consciousness and your own bias, and how that feeds into how you interpret the world around you. And I love stuff like that. I love just little stuff like that, little things like that, just to get people thinking.
And it affects how you interact with the world too. Like I was just thinking, that experiment that you just mentioned. um I find myself doing that a lot. Like if I see someone wearing something that I connect with, I will often I often feel like a lot safer around them, or in a way, and
Yeah.
I can come up to them and be like, "Oh, hey, I like your shirt," or something like that, right? And whereas on the opposite happens as well. We recently met someone, and this person, we were doing sort of a professional transaction with this person. I don't want to give too much detail, but anyways, this person had a cross tattoo, like right all the way across their arm. And my immediate, like, it was a really nice person, nothing against him, but like my immediate response of judgment was like, oh, they must be like highly religious, kind of like a little bit more distance than I will if I saw someone with a Nirvana tattoo. I would probably like compliment the tattoo or something, right? Like, and so yeah, it definitely shows your different biases.
It is.
Um,
It's amazing. It really is. And I mean, we were talking about the show, how I used to be, before I got COVID and all that stuff, how I used to be, super fit, to put it lightly. And I've got a lot of tattoos, and the reaction I get from people when I'm doing the religious studies stuff, when I'm working with other people, and like for the first time when I first meet them, or the philosophy stuff when I first meet them. And I'm not a tall guy, but I'm a pretty big guy, and I'm covered in tattoos. And when I first approach these people, and they kind of look at me as though to say, "Shit, what's he doing walking towards me with such a?" And I'm quite a I've got quite a like fiery personality, so I'm quite determined when I walk. I'm not meek. I don't hunch up or anything. And when I'm walking
Confidence.
towards someone covered in tattoos, and I'm walking towards them and they're looking at me, you can see the fear on the faces. And then I introduce myself, and then they realize, oh, you're here to talk about philosophy, or you're here to talk about consciousness, or religious studies. And the demeanor completely changes when they realize who I am, and that they've been communicating with me via email or whatever for a couple of months. And then they finally meet me in person, and I'm not what they expect. And it's such an interesting thing to observe, that observe how you respond to other people and how other people respond to you, and how those perceptions can change in an instant, because there's really no reason, AJ, for you to feel safer with someone in a Nirvana t-shirt than someone who's got a
Right.
cross tattoo.
Very true. Very true.
Exactly. Yeah, but it gives way to like this the biases that we keep. It's interesting because for me, I've always loved tattoos, but also had that sort of bias. Like if somebody that's completely covered in them, um, it kind of made you feel a little bit uncomfortable. But then when I came out of religion, I was like, well, why do I feel this way? Like meeting, Jason Friedman.
I
He's
was
like
just going to mention
obviously
Jason. I was
right, yeah.
literally just going to say, and then you met Jason Friedman, and all that changed.
And like, yeah, like he lives in my city, so like we met a couple times and stuff. I like it. I've met him in person several times.
He's a
He's
great guy,
huge,
Jason.
big guy, but like the sweetest person ever.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, and then you see him playing metal music, like hardcore metal, and you're like, how is this the same person? But yeah, like it goes to show like that dudes are just yeah, it's just think, and that's how I got into getting my own, because I was like, forget it, like I love tattoos. And then I would say now I'm way more likely to have that sort of safety feeling with someone that does have tattoos than with somebody who doesn't.
That
um
which feeds into what we were talking about earlier, of the mind building up a picture of the world through memory, through past experience, and it all it's all connected. It all shows how the reason you feel safe with someone isn't just like a snapshot decision. It's built up in your brain and through past experience. I just want to point out that Hive Science said a while ago in the chat, because I was talking about when people, your feet getting fed into this information before you do something. Hive Science said, yes, that's priming. Yeah, that is the name for it. It's called priming, when somebody uh, gives you information, and kind of in philosophy we'd call it poisoning the well, where people gives you information before you do something, so you're predisposed to seeing things from that perspective. Uh, but Hive Science also said that we used to work together on a call-in show years ago, and we did. And it was a jolly good time as well. That's
oh,
where
that's
I
fun.
started out. It's where Dr. Ben started out. Um, and yeah, we had a great time. That was over on Ethan Michael's The Perspective show, which
Oh,
was
okay, gotcha. Yeah.
fantastic. Yeah, it's where we all started our kind of, well, it's where I started my call-in show experience. I've been doing the talkie in real life for a long time, but it's the first time I'd kind of come onto the internet and done it. The one thing that was positive about COVID was that it opened up this kind of online world
No.
that, for a lot of people that had not had access to it before, and had got into this whole new community, which really was helpful for a lot of people. And that's one thing that did come out of it that was really positive. I think I started doing the perspective, and I met Sue. I'd seen a couple of videos, and I always laugh when I say this, because it really sounds like I'm like being offensive to them, but I'm really not. I'd seen a couple of content creators, and I'd been thinking about creating content myself, but I really was, I didn't know anything about technology or anything, and I thought, I don't think I can do this. I genuinely don't think I can go on the internet and talk to people. And then I saw Laura McGee and Richard, who I used to do Sceptic Hangout with, a podcast that lasted nearly 100 episodes. And I'd seen them put videos out, and I thought, well, they're not very well produced. If they can do it, so can I. So it kind of sounds like an insult, but it isn't. It's I've
Yeah.
got me and Laura and Richard started that podcast, and it really did a lot for all three of us. It was great, a great time.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, yeah, like a couple of years ago, I would have never imagined being able to do this. My anxiety and
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
my Yeah, public speaking had never been my thing before. So it's weird. It's weird because like you have an audience, but you don't see it. Um,
See,
so
I was
it's
fine with public speaking. I've done this. I've done this for years. I've talked to people about what they believe and why for years and years. Over 30 years I've been doing this. And I've no problem with having a conversation with someone in real life and or standing on a stage in front of someone in real life. But if you go back to the very, very, very first episode of Sceptic Takeout, when I didn't even have my microphone was awful. I can't even remember what I think I was using an old handheld video camera to film it. Everything was awful, and I was so nervous, and it was so icky to watch. It's still up there if you want. If you want to see me look really bad, it's still up there. Go and watch it at Skeptic Takeout episode number 1. It is awful. It really, really is. Yeah, it takes time to do it. It takes time to get used to changing mediums, even if you're used to doing it in another format.
Oh, I completely agree. My earlier content, sometimes I'm like, I really need to re-record these videos because the audio is terrible. It was from a laptop microphone, like the built-in camera from the laptop and the microphone. So the sound is terrible. Um, I've redone a couple and then I hide the original so people don't no
She
longer
had.
see it. So I'm like, oh shit, like people are actually watching this stuff. But
You got
like
to
we
start
we
somewhere.
progress, yeah, we
Yeah.
progress and move on, right? My very first episode of doing a calling show was Truth Wanted, but then and I was sweating the entire time so much. But he made me feel so comfortable that I was like, I want to do this again. It was fun. But yeah. So, anyways, let's keep talking about this topic of consciousness. Something you said earlier, when you mentioned this person that has seen for the very first time, it made me remember of my own experience with my hearing because, like I said, I grew up until like age 15 or so with no uh, devices to help me hear, right? So then I got the hearing aids, which were it's kind of like voices were a little bit higher but still really muffled. So like it was really hard for me to be able to partake in group conversations or somewhere in a restaurant or even at school. And so I was kind of like in my own little bubble world. If I went to a party, I was the one that was sitting in the corner just reading a book or something. And so when I got my cochlear implant, I had already been married to Joe for many, many years. And our kid was a lot younger. What was that? When did I say 2017? So about 6 years old. No, sorry. I think the implant was 18. Anyways, 8 years old, my kid.
You're around 8.
So throughout their earlier life, I had a really hard time hearing their voice and their pronunciations of words and stuff like that. Even my own pronunciation of words was pretty bad. I came to find out later. So I had to relearn both to hear and to speak because my speech. I don't know how Joe put up with it, but I'm pretty sure it was pretty terrible
It wasn't
before all
that
of
bad.
this. Okay, good. So I have to often make an effort to not mispronounce words or to remember, hey, the SC is pronounced like not like ch. Like I used to say stomach instead of stomach, right? Things like that. And so yeah, like being able to experience Joe's voice or kid's voice was a completely new experience from like what I already knew about them. So like I wouldn't say like it changed the way I felt about them, but it changed the way I perceived them, I guess you could say. So I think it's really interesting. So all of this makes me wonder, right? We were talking about the different phases on how our consciousness changes based on our experiences, like the input that we have. So we could say in a way that consciousness is kind of a spectrum, and where do we consider humans to be at the peak of consciousness? Like, are we like? I guess my question is, what is the? Do we have the potential to have more consciousness? Is that even a thing? Because we can't really fathom thinking about more as something that has higher
That
consciousness than what we experience, right?
that is a brilliant question, and as with all brilliant questions, the answer is
Okay,
I
good.
don't know. the
That's a good
I
answer.
think are we at the peak? Can we experience more or different forms of consciousness? Who knows? Who knows? I think it's arrogant and naive to kind of say we're at the peak of consciousness. Uh, Consciousness is a spectrum, and I don't think the thing is, and this is why I argue, and you two know this because I've shouted this from the rooftops every time I've been on your show, and every time I get to talk about consciousness anywhere, I shout this from the rooftops. Consciousness forums need animal biologists who study consciousness on them. I mentioned earlier in the show that AJ had sent me that really, really good panel discussion yesterday, and there was not an animal biologist in sight on it. And this to me is criminal, to limit consciousness studies to human consciousness. Alex O'Connor on that video, on that forum, gave an answer, a thought experiment out to people. And he said, it was something along the lines of, if you're falling from an aeroplane or off a cliff, and you had no prior knowledge of the prior moment, or you didn't have the ability to foresee like future moments, if you were purely in the here and now, would you even know you were falling? Now, that to me, that on its own was kind of not particularly interesting, I'll be honest. But when you take into account that creatures who are not self-aware, as you know, one of the greatest studies that's been done on kind of perception, not consciousness as such, but perception, is on amoebas. Amoebas have been really, really largely studied regarding perception, and they have, the way they interpret the world, they have a temporal kind of two-phase way of interacting with the world. They are aware of time. They have a very rudimentary memory. And I think that's really, really important to take into account when, and it kind of peaked this when Alex mentioned that on that video regarding things that it's not just human consciousness. Why the fuck are we relating this just to human consciousness when even the most basic, not even creatures, I don't even know if you'd call them creatures, most basic organisms that can perceive, have a concept of temporal awareness?
Yeah.
Why the fuck on? And I will shout this from every soapbox in the land I get chance from. Why aren't animal biologists encountered? Because it is so clear to me. It is so clear to me that the physical makeup of the creature is integral to that particular creature's consciousness, to that creature's umbalt, the way the sensory bubble of that species. It's obvious. And I think it's obvious to everybody who studies it that this is the case. And yet, when it comes to consciousness studies, when it comes to consciousness forums, they are left out completely. And that is criminal, because we can learn so much about consciousness by including people who study animals. And one of the really interesting things for me is I mentioned earlier this hard problem of consciousness. Nagel's paper, What's It Like to Be a Bat, really, really did inform this idea of the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is that not only so What's It Like to Be a Bat talks about the fact that we can't know what it's like to be a bat, which is true. And this is often cited in the hardcore problem of consciousness as an argument against physicalism, as an argument against the physical producing conscious. And the hard problem of consciousness says, because we cannot reduce consciousness to a particular, we can't say that consciousness comes from this particular part of the brain specifically, that, and this is the important part, and this is a part a lot of people often get wrong, it's not a God of the gaps thing where people are infilling gaps in knowledge. This is not what the hard problem of consciousness is saying. It's saying not just that currently we do not know where consciousness can be reduced to in the brain. It is saying that consciousness cannot be reduced to the brain. So it's not a case that currently we don't know, but potentially in future we might do. It is saying it cannot be reduced to this. And Nagel's paper, What's It Like to Be a Bat? I don't know if that's the actual name of it. That's what I'm calling it. That's kind of a big thing in this thing of hard consciousness. I think the opposite. I think when we actually look at this sensory sphere of different species, we actually can relate how their consciousness and how they experience to their physical makeup. And I don't think that's a problem. I think it's actually the opposite. I think it informs us. It's really interesting to me as well, and this is kind of going on to general philosophy. It's really interesting to me how we say there's this hard problem, and a lot of people in consciousness studies who ignore biological animals, a lot of people in consciousness studies say that there's a hard problem of consciousness because, and this is why this distinction is important, because we can never, ever know, we can never, ever reduce it to a particular part of the brain. We wouldn't do that in any other area of science. We wouldn't say, well, we don't currently know what the, whether the Big Bang's the real reason the universe started, so therefore the Big Bang cannot be the reason the universe, and that's it, that's out of the door completely. We wouldn't say that in any other field. And yet we do it with this hard problem of consciousness. And I don't know why we do it with this hard problem of consciousness, because there's really no reason to do that. There's no reason to define it as we cannot reduce consciousness to the brain.
Yeah, this makes me think of dreams, going back to dreams, right? Like we understand that dreams are a thing. We can say, oh yeah, dreams are real. Not part of like awake reality, right? Like of consciousness, but they are a part of the brain. And we still can't tell exactly what part of the brain they come from or what exact part of the brain memories are stored in, but we know that memories are a thing and that they're real and that they are a concept that we can see through imaging and studying the brain, that it is happening. And it's, for me, it's the same thing with consciousness. We can compare it to dreams. We can compare it. Um, we can compare both of them to each other, sort of. So, sorry, my train of thought got lost because it's got way too many things there. But we can compare them in the way that we can study the brain, and whereas we cannot pinpoint the exact location, we can say, okay, all of the parts coming together are causing the dream, and all of the parts together are causing the consciousness as well. Um, so this book that I recommended to you, I think you're gonna love it because of everything that you were just talking about, um, how animal biologists should be a bigger part of the conversation. And while both of the writers of this book are neuroscientists and not animal biologists, there is a lot of animal biology involved in the book. It goes back way back in time, down the chain of life. And what you mentioned about the amoebas is in the book as well. It starts with like one of the smallest and older known organisms, the archaea, which I think is like a billions of years old is where it's put at their original ones, and then it moves to bacteria, amoebas, worms, flies. Then it goes on to larger animals, organisms like fish, frogs, tortoise, birds, and then eventually it goes on to talk about monkeys and humans. But what it does is that in each chapter it puts one of these organisms and it breaks down why and how each one of them had to develop through very small steps towards what we understand to be consciousness today. For example, in the archaea they use it um, to compare why we develop purpose. Like the purpose of it was to move toward the food, right? um, the bacteria developed targeting, which is another like trying to reach a target, right? Which is slightly more complex than just aimlessly moving towards a food source. And so all of these more complex mechanisms were developing different characteristics in order to reach the food more successfully. Um, Things like decision making, and like you say, amoebas who have some sort of memory in the way that um, if they moved towards an area that had less food, it could sort of remember that there was more food behind it, and so with the mechanisms that it had developed, it was able to move itself back toward the area that had more food. And so
Yeah,
it's a
that's
way of
exactly right, and that was a
yeah.
huge leap, and absolutely this ability to kind of have this temporal memory was a huge leap in the development of consciousness.
Yeah, and then so the book goes on to talk about I don't know, communication, how why these creatures developed communication, multitasking, perception. And I don't know, this is why like science really fascinates me. Like it's so easy to use the god of the gaps and be like, well, we're conscious and we don't know where it came from, and so it must have been given to us. But it is a much harder task to be able to connect all of these organisms to different features of consciousness that we know today. And because we all come from the same organisms of way back, right? um Even though creationists may not agree, we do. And so like we can see how humans eventually came to develop this level of consciousness that we currently have. And that's what made me wonder also about the question that I asked earlier, right? Like, could there be higher levels of consciousness? And I'm sure they could be. Like, we don't know yet. Maybe
Yeah, that
one day we'll
possibly.
develop
Yeah,
them.
I mean, when you talk about it's difficult because when we talk about kind of higher levels of consciousness, we have this kind of ability or kind of leaning from, so some people have this leaning to kind of attach some kind of supernatural element to that or some kind of universal element to that, and I don't think we need to do that. I think rather than talking about in those cases, I think instead of talking about higher levels of consciousness, we're better talking about more subtle levels of consciousness. You know, I've meditated for many years, and what I hear other people who've meditated describe as higher levels of consciousness or people who want to kind of attach a mystical element to it, talk about higher levels consciousness. I've experienced as subtle levels of consciousness. It's being more aware of the consciousness that is already there, rather than having a gateway opened to this kind of mystical extra level thing. And I think that's an important distinction to make. And I think some of the language we use sometimes poisons what we kind of mean, which can be described a lot simpler. And I think having so I've not read this book that you've recommended to me. I'm looking forward to reading it, but I've not read it as yet, just because I've been far too busy to read it. Having read it yourself, have you gained a great of appreciation for how important animals and kind of like lower life forms, if you want to use that phrase, how they perceive the world and their consciousness and their awareness? Has that informed a whole new picture for you for how important that is in consciousness study?
Oh yeah, for me absolutely, because we most of the conversations that we see talk about um human consciousness. And so one of the things that got me into going vegan was conversations that I had with Dan, from Truth One at Dan. And he and I were talking about bees and fish, and how they experience the world, and how they can feel pain. And when I look at things like, okay, I was watching a random video the other day, that little shorts that pop up, and you see these. I think it wasn't a dog. What was it? I think it was a kind of monkey. And so there were, I'm sure you've seen these videos where they see someone that they haven't seen in years, who had rescued them or done something very positive in the animal's life. And they meet this person again, and the animal remembers that person and becomes completely overjoyed. And so it makes you wonder, what are they experiencing, because they obviously have to realize that this is somebody else. And if they meet somebody that had, say, for example, you have two people, one of them that saved their life and the other one was the person that caused them harm, the harm that they had to be rescued from, like their reactions are going to be completely different. So like they are aware that these are completely different beings, so in a way we can compare their consciousness a lot to ours, even if it may not be a level of consciousness that an amoeba has, and it may not be the exact same level of consciousness that a human has. It's somewhere in between. And it always brings me back to evolution, like the physical evolution that animals have experienced, right? Why do we not put the same thought into the conscious evolution that they've experienced? So,
Yes, so much. It's so much uh, in what you've just said to talk about. Uh, I
I'm
think
sure.
I'm going to return to evolution in a second, but I think first of all, I think it's really important, and I think I've said this before on your show, that I think we need to be careful when,
That anthropomorphize animals. Yeah, I know.
yeah, I do think we need to be careful when we're talking about animal consciousness, not to compare it to our own too much.
Mm,
And it's not because I'm trying to build a barrier between them. I think we have a danger of looking from the human perspective and kind of inserting human emotion on that. And I genuinely think, and this is part of the reason I think why animals needs to be included in consciousness studies. I think they have a completely different perspective. I think their sensory bubble is completely different. And where we might see similarities, it doesn't mean that I think that's more we're correlating things that may not be there. Now, in some creatures like monkeys, like apes, that we're closely related to, I think we've got a stronger case of saying when it appears to be showing a certain emotion, when it appears to be undertaking a certain activity which appears to be human-like, it is more strongly likely to be what we perceive it to be. I think that can be a mistake when we're not talking about things we're closely related to, and we're talking about completely different creatures when they behave in a way that appears to be showing something. I think we've got to be very careful to attribute that thing to them because we don't know.
Well,
And where
can I
we
ask a super quick question based on that, what you just said? So when we study the brain, like obviously our brain is a lot more closely related to apes, more closely similar to apes. But when we look at other animals and study their physiology, we often use animals that have similar organs to humans. For example, I don't know if you're studying hearts, you're going to go to pigs and such things. And so if we can compare our brains to other animals' brains, we do see a lot of differences, but we also see a lot of similarities. Why would we consider that they're not feeling the same if their brain anatomy, structures, hormones, chemicals are so similar?
Yeah, another great question. I think we've got to do it in kind of layers, if you like. And when we do have those similarities that we can make reasonable assumptions that they are similar, then we can make that connection. And it might not be the fact that just in apes we do that, and then in crows we do something completely different. It might be in the same creature. As you said, pigs is a really, really good example. Pigs are a really, really good example. That a lot of the way pigs' behavior and the pigs' kind of makeup is very, very similar to ours. So in a lot of ways, we can use pigs as a good comparison to humans. Certainly, I don't think there's any doubt that pigs feel pain, that pigs feel emotion. They're not figs. I don't know why I said figs. Pigs feel pain and pigs feel emotion. Maybe figs do. Who knows? But I think in other ways, when we're talking about, they certainly have different senses of smell to ours and things like that. So we've got to be very careful not to, as I said at the very start of this program, a lot of these things are very, very subtle. And this is why I don't like labeling myself as something, because there's always those nuances that are there. So where I'm saying we've got to be careful, it doesn't mean that we can't make those connections where those connections are reasonably inferenced.
True.
What I'm saying is that we have to be very careful in this idea that just because it appears to be doing something which is human-like, we don't attribute human-like behavior or emotions to it without having good reason to do so. I've just mentioned crows. Crows are a really good example. Crows are something that remember what people have done to them, and they don't just remember individually what people have done to them. They react to that. So if they've done something positive, if they feed them, they'll come and sit on them and things like that. If we've done something negative to them, they'll react negatively to us, but not just individually, throughout the community as well. So if we've done something bad to one crow, the whole community that crow is involved in will react to us
Wow.
negatively.
I
Wow.
was not
So
aware of that. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah,
yeah,
so it makes you think that they do have an awareness of the individual, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely. And magpies mate for life. And I've been in the unfortunate situation where I've seen a magpie killed, and then the rest of the community come down and kind of sit around it. And that is an amazing thing, especially if you're me and is as interested in consciousness as I am, to sit and observe that, because you're observing yourself, observing that, and you're thinking, what are they thinking as well? Going back to Nagel and what's it like to be a bat? What is it like to? What are they experiencing in this moment? Is it something like human emotion? Are they mourning?
Yeah.
Or is it just are they just trying to figure out what's happened? Are they trying to decipher if that, if the companion's still alive or dead? We don't know. And that's what makes it
Right.
so fast. And that's why consciousness is in its infancy, because there's a lot of questions we simply do not know the answer to.
Yeah, and I am with you completely that we shouldn't place human emotions and the same level of the same type of consciousness to non-human animals. I think for me, it's more like the curiosity, like wondering exactly what is it that they're experiencing, like how
Yeah.
is their consciousness similar and how is it different to human. Because like obviously I'm not going to think that a fish has the same type of consciousness that a human does, or that it feels love, or that it feels empathy, or that it feels I'm sure they do have some way of, like we said, feeling of the self versus another one of their same species, like their child or whatever, their offspring. And so but for me it's like, okay, I see them having some kind of consciousness, and I love meat. I like the flavor of meat and all of that, but it does bring up the question of like, what are they experiencing, and am I causing them a type of harm that I can avoid? So yeah, that's where my, I guess, where my brain process goes to, that I'm not necessarily thinking that they are experiencing the same that a human would, because that would be unreasonable for me to do
Yeah,
that.
it's great. I mean, even the whole makeup of of the physiology of a creature, a dog's skull, the way a dog's skull is made up, largely contributes to its amazing sense of smell.
Mhm.
And to and this is why looking at these different creatures, elephants are another one, absolutely amazing. uh how do you confuse an elephant? You put the scent of one of its pack, you take the scent of one of its packets, urine or whatever, and you go 2 miles down the road where you know it's going to be, and you put that scent there because they know it's from someone in their pack, and they can't work out why that smells where it is when that person in the herd, I should call it the proper terminology, shouldn't I? Not a pack. Someone in the herd who's in the herd and behind them, why their scent is 2 miles in front of them. This is an actual experiment that has been done. And it's really interesting how animals' physiological makeup contributes to their consciousness. And this, for me, I think this for me is the clincher that says that consciousness is most definitely a byproduct of the physical.
Yeah.
It's not, some people will argue that it's a universal property which is filtered through the physical. I don't think we have the grounds to make that claim. I think when we do look at different species and their different sensory perceptions, and the fact that their consciousness is directly related to their physical makeup, I think it really does inform. It's not conclusive, and it would be wrong to say it is, but it really, really does inform that that consciousness is a byproduct of the physical makeup of the creature. Our consciousness heavily relies on the neocortex, and when we go back to our earliest ancestors, when we first see the neocortex, it is a tiny, tiny lump in a rat-like creature. It's a barely perceptible lump. They've done 3D scans on the fossils of these creatures and made casts, and there's a barely perceptible lump. And this is what in the human brain almost completely encases the human brain.
Right.
And we can trace that through its evolutionary path. And I think anybody arguing that consciousness is not a byproduct of the physical has a very, very big uphill struggle. And I think this is why a lot of them just do away with kind of accepting evolution and stuff to start
Right.
with. Because if you get rid of the evidence, if you just pretend the evidence isn't there, then it's easier to make an alternative claim. And but yeah, it's hugely, hugely fascinating and desperately needed animal studies. And I'm going to say it again, desperately needed
Uh,
animal studies in consciousness studies. Make it happen.
I completely agree, and I think we will make so many discoveries if we focus on that a little bit. Like we will speed up the process in understanding consciousness. That video that we watched. This is a little bit different area of consciousness. We did cover this a little bit before, right? But on the video with Brian Cox, um, one of the panel members, Katrina, something with a K. Anyway, she specialized in. She was the one that specialized in hallucinations, and she was talking about studying auditory hallucinations. Things like when you have a strong or not just auditory but like physical hallucinations, I guess you could call them. And like when you have a strong expectation of something, like if you're expecting a phone call and then suddenly you feel your phone vibrating in your pocket and you look at it and there's no indication that it vibrated, but it's because you were expecting that it sort of made it happen in a way. And this reminded me of this study that I was reading. It was published in the Schizophrenia Bulletin like a week ago or something like that, and from the Oxford University. And the research was focused on the previous hypothesis that people with schizophrenia who have who hear voices, right, could be hearing their own thoughts. It was just an idea that they had. And because in healthy individuals, when or on inner voice speaks, right, like the auditory part of your brain is suppressed so that we don't feel like we're actually hearing the voice in the same way that we would an outside a sound coming from the outside. But when they did this study and they studied people's brains, and they found that somebody with schizophrenia that had auditory hallucinations was using their inner speech. Their auditory cortex was not being suppressed. So, in a way, their brain was interpreting their inner voice as if it was an external voice, and it cannot differentiate from an actual sound from the inner voice. And I think a lot of people, maybe just me, um, but a lot of people have more than one voice, right? You can be talking to yourself back and forth in a conversation. You can be remembering somebody else's voice telling you something, or there can be more than two characters in the conversation that you're having in your head. And so it appears that people with schizophrenia were experiencing their own inner voice or voices as if they were coming from the outside. And so they were thinking that they were hearing all of these people that are not there when it's in fact coming in from inside their brain. So like that, I don't know, that it just reminded me of that because such a fascinating way that the differences of how the brain is structured changes the way that you perceive the whole world.
Yeah,
So it's like, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Well, I was
no,
just going to
you
say real quick. So it's basically like your conscious mind. I mean, you're perceiving those internal voices, but someone with schizophrenia, they're not able to determine that those voices, whether they're internal or external voices, basically.
Right, the
Like a,
brain is processing it as if it was a sound coming from the
correct. So they
outside.
think it's like a creation of their external reality, basically. Yeah. Wow. That's wild.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, Richard. Go ahead.
you don't have to apologize for interrupting me when, first of all, it's your show, and secondly, I talk forever anyway. Please feel free to have your turn whenever you feel like it.
No worries.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think in the 90s, particularly when or the late I think it was the late 80s when the kind of very first rudimentary brain scans started like really informing in consciousness, and it developed through the 90s. I think that was a kind of pivotal period for this idea of consciousness study, and because we could see for the first time in a very rudimentary way, and it's got more advanced since then, and it will continue to get more advanced. We could see in a very, very rudimentary way the way, not just we weren't reliant on self-reporting as we were before. We could see literally into the brain the areas light up when certain emotions were taking place, when memories were taking place, when when we were being subject to particular visual stimuli or auditory stimuli. We could see for the first time in the brain which parts of the brain were lighting up, and that was a really, really important step in consciousness studies. And it's only getting more advanced. Antonio Damasio, in I think it was in The Feeling of What Happens, one of his books, made a very, very interesting comment, and it was, I'm going to paraphrase because it's about 10 years since I actually read it, but it was something along the lines of, we will one day get to the point where we can see exactly where in the brain certain things come from. So certain memories, particular memories, we will be able to literally see pictures of these taking place in the brain, but we will never be able to experience what that person's feeling when these memories are taking place. And that's I love that quote. Bear in mind, Antonio Damasio is not a believer in the hard problem of consciousness as well. So that's a very, very interesting quote, because on the surface it sounds like a hard problem of consciousness quote, and it's not. And I think that is something that is good, really, when we do get to that stage, and we're not at that stage yet. It is really, really going to. I genuinely believe we're going to get to the stage where we can create visual images of what people are thinking. I genuinely do
I
think at
think,
some
yeah.
point we're going to get to that point, and that is going to really open a whole new door in consciousness studies. And then it is going to be about the connection between that picture, that image, and what people are feeling when they're experiencing that image, to bring it back round to that Antonio Damasio quote. And that is where the pivotal part of consciousness studies is going to be in the future. Not that people feel a certain way, not that people are experiencing a certain thing, but how they are feeling when they are experiencing that. And to take it right back round to what I said at the very, very beginning of this program, is that consciousness is a process and not a thing. And watching that process unfold is the most, for me, the most interesting part of consciousness studies, and in it is about, this kind of idea that the brain is the car and this the consciousness is the locomotion, the movement. I think it is about tracking that movement rather than worrying too much, which is what this is the stage we're at now, where what we're trying to do is look at the car and say which parts of the car produce that movement. I think in the future, it's going to be much more about let's track that movement, and we're not going to be too bothered about the car itself because we already know the car's involved. What's important is the trajectory of the car based on the movement.
Yeah, but see, that's where perspective comes in and makes things a little trickier, because you can have two people with the same memory looking at the same um thing in the, let's say you and I, Richard, are standing in front of secular reality, and one of us is a believer, right? Let's say that I believe in God and you don't, and we're both looking at him and he's talking about kindness. What we are going to remember is going to be completely different because of our brain wiring. um, and so it will be so hard to remake this image of this same person that for me it may look like Jesus, and for you it may look like just a random guy that forgot to shave, you know.
Yeah, and that's
And so
exactly what I was saying earlier when I was talking about the person entering the room and seeing the ghost, that they are actually seeing that thing. And this is what makes it so difficult. It's not that they aren't seeing anything there because of the priming that's gone off, because of the way the brain operates, because we're in a strange environment, we've not got much sensory information. They are actually seeing that thing. So, and this is why we have got to take experience so seriously, and we shouldn't dismiss experience. When a religious person says, I have had a religious experience, the argument shouldn't be about, well, no, you've not had that experience. Well, yes, I have. The argument should be, well, let's examine that and see if what you're attributing the experience to is reasonable to experience it to, or whether there might be other candidate explanations which are more probable or even possible.
right, exactly, like the guy dreaming, barely waking up and thinking that he's a demon, right? Like you can explain that in different ways, even though he did experience that and in his memory that's going to be as real as any other memory. So what, I was watching another video by Brian Cox, and no, sorry, it was Alex O'Connor. I think it was actually, yeah, Brian Cox wasn't it? It was Alex O'Connor, and he was talking to someone, and they were discussing what does it take exactly for someone to no longer have consciousness, or to completely change the way they're no longer who they were before that moment. Basically not recognize themselves as themselves, because if you slice a finger off, then you're still gonna be yourself. If you lose both of your legs, you're still gonna be yourself. There may be changes in the way that you're experiencing the world because you're now gonna be using a wheelchair, right? So in a sense, you will be different, but at the core, you still recognize yourself as the person that you were. And I think, was it you and I that were talking about the guy that had the pole through his brain? Okay,
Yeah, very
I thought so.
probably. Yeah.
Right, yeah. And people that have their brains cut in half as a treatment to for certain conditions, traumatic brain injuries, all kinds of situations where there is a major shift in the brain, but the personality, the memories, and other factors remain the same. And when I think about people with memory loss, dementia, Alzheimer's, I can't help but think and wonder, how do people who believe in ghosts and souls, or that consciousness is given by God, how do they explain all of those things? Like, how do you explain that the memories are gone, that the person doesn't recognize themselves anymore as that person, because a completely different type of consciousness? Like, where did their consciousness go? So I don't know. For me, that just always continues to confirm that it is a process of a physical process.
Yeah, I thought you were going to stray into the transporter problem then, regarding
Oh,
self. Let's not go
what
there.
is that?
Let's
Okay, we want.
yeah. The transporter problem is this idea that when it was originally put forward, and you mentioned secular rarity. I actually did a show, and secular rarity was part of the panel on that show where we were discussing the transporter problem. So the transporter problem is that the original version is that if you are going to a transporter like a Star Trek transporter,
Mhm.
and your molecules are completely dissolved and transported to Mars and recreated from the soil of Mars. And this is a very, very important point in the problem, which is often overlooked by people discussing it. And recreate you, recreate that memory of you, that image of you, with everything exactly as it was. Is that you, or is that not you? And I thought that's where you were going with that, but
Oh, okay.
let's not go there today, because let's
So,
leave that as a teaser for next time.
all right, all right. We can do a whole show about the transporter problem next time.
Yeah, that sounds
Yeah,
like that could
no.
get lengthy in discussion on that for sure.
Yeah, that's funny. Um, but we were talking about bad ideas over here. So moving a little bit into philosophy, if you want, because we've been going for 2 hours about
No, we
consciousness.
can continue for a bit. We're fine.
I could continue with it, but I was wondering, do you have any logical fallacies that really frustrate you, that really like trigger you
I
when
don't
people
think
use them?
there are any that particular. The thing is with logical fallacies, and this is why they don't particularly frustrate me, is that we're all prone to making them, and I think it's one of those things that it's important to point out when we see people making them, but it's also important not particularly to blame people for making them, because a logical fallacy is in its essence just a cognitive mistake the brain's making. So I don't think, when I see people making them, I don't necessarily get frustrated by the fact they're making them. Where I do get frustrated is where I point them out, and I point logical fallacies out to atheists probably more than I do theists, by the way. Uh, but this is why I'm not a great atheist personality, because I will argue with atheists. So a lot of people, potential supporters, don't like me because I will argue with them, because I don't give a shit. If you're wrong, you're wrong. I'm not bothered if you're on my side of the fence on a particular question or not. What frustrates me about people making logical fallacies is when you point them out trying to be helpful, because when I have these conversations, the reason I have these conversations is to try and give people a better scaffold and a better framework by which to assess things from. I'm not doing it maliciously. So when I point out that someone might be using a logical fallacy, and then they say, "No, I'm not," or even worse, "No, I'm not," and if you think I am, well, you're using one as well. That's where it becomes frustrating, and it happens quite a lot. Just because people don't like being called out on stuff. So people using logical fallacies in and of themselves is not something that frustrates me. I recognize them for what they are. Uh, I think learning logical fallacies and going back to the t-shirt thing I was on about earlier and practicing them on yourself, and by that I mean observing yourself and recognizing when you're making them, it's a really, really, really good practice. If somebody tells me that if I see people pointing out logical fallacies other people are making and they tell me they never make them themselves, that immediately raises red flags to me, because we all make them. It's whether we're aware that we're making them and we can correct that's important. Just because the brain makes cognitive mistakes, that's what it does. So yeah, I think that's the short answer to the question. If I can ever give a short answer to a question, that is it.
No, that was a good answer. That was a good answer. But it made me wonder. You say that you point them out more often in atheists. What do you think that is? Like, what are some of the more common
Uh,
fallacies that atheists make? Because
I
I
don't think
often make them, but like I until I came into this community and started learning, I didn't realize that I was.
I don't think there's any particular fallacy that atheists make more than theists as such.
Mm.
I tend to just notice them more in atheists, I think, because I'm concentrating on other things more with theists. I'm concentrating much more with on a kind of epistemological kind of grounding with the theist. So I'm not particular. I expect them to make logical fallacies. So I think I notice them more
Yeah.
in atheists when I see an atheist make them. So it's not necessarily that I don't think they necessarily make them more. I think I just notice them more, so I end up picking atheists up on them more than I do theists.
That's true. That's a good point. Yeah, I think I agree with that. Is there? Well, let me ask you. On your book, when you say that first chapter is about philosophy, what do you cover on it? Like, is there a specific area of philosophy that most interests you, or what do you want to take the philosophy
uh,
conversation today?
uh, I think, look, the thing is with philosophy, I love philosophy, but I get frustrated, and I do mention this in the book. Phil Bros really, really fuck me off. This is I've started using the term Philbro because everybody uses it. I used to call them YouTube philosophers, and
Okay.
it's this kind of person who watches a YouTube video on philosophy and suddenly thinks they're an expert. I don't like when I'm having a conversation with someone. I don't like using technical terms because most often when I'm having a conversation with someone, it's on a platform like this where we've got viewers who don't understand all the technical terms. And I don't think there's any need to use the technical terms. Sometimes specific terms will be used, like when the standout one that comes up most often is necessary being and contingency, and that's specific to a certain thing. And I think it's important to know what that means, but we don't have to sit there and use it all the time. Once we understand a contingent thing is just something that had a previous cause. I'm contingent because I'm contingent on my parents. A necessary being, it doesn't have to be a being, a conscious thing. It's just a thing. A necessary being is just something that has to exist necessarily, and that's it. It's and I think once we've dispensed with that, we can continue with the conversation once we understand what we're talking about. I think the problem is with Philbros is that they like to introduce all these technical terms and have the full conversation using these technical terms. And it's not necessary. If you know what you're talking about, you don't have to do that. It might be necessary as I've just done on occasion to to explain what a particular term means and clarify it for people who might not understand. But we don't have to carry out the whole conversation like that. And another thing that Phil Bros do on both sides of the fence, which really annoys me, is I'm interested in philosophy for one reason and one reason only, because I like exploring subjects. I like exploring questions. And I hear so much somebody saying this is this or this is this, as though it's final and decided in philosophy. And in the vast majority of cases, it's not. These things aren't decided. These things are
No.
still being talked about. And you shouldn't, without gatekeeping, because I'm not a gatekeeper. I'm not the be all and end all of philosophy. So I'm not trying to gatekeep here, and other people have different styles. But I don't think you should be speaking in terms of absolutes, especially when it comes to philosophy, because there are questions that need answers. One of the things that is, in my mind, undecided, which we get an absolute again from both sides of the argument, is this idea of necessary versus contingent when it comes to the universe. Is the universe necessary or is it contingent? I have no fucking clue. I don't know. And I don't think, I'm not an expert in it. I've no academic background in it, but I do enjoy cosmology. I do enjoy physics as a hobby, as a pastime, reading about it. And from reading what the experts are saying, I don't think the experts know either. So when you get a Phil bro, when you get somebody who's watched a couple of YouTube philosophy videos coming up and saying the universe is definitively contingent or the universe is definitively necessary,
Mm.
that just makes me want to wring their neck, because that is not the case. It's we don't know the answer to that. And it's very, very important to acknowledge that we don't know the answer to that. We can still have the conversation. We can still talk about it, and we can still have a real, one of the best sets of conversations, and I say sets because it went on over a number of weeks on TikTok, was with a theist, a God believing Christian who had a degree in philosophy. And we had conversations over a number of weeks, and I don't think either of us, unless it was necessary to do so, mentioned a single technical philosophical term. And we
Right.
managed to hold a brilliant conversation exploring a number of subjects and fully understanding what each other meant. And we weren't shouting at each other, we weren't arguing with each other. Not a single one of us said, "This is this." We were just exploring the subject from two different paradigms, two different worldviews, and we managed to have great, great conversations. And that for me is what philosophy is about. It is not about, I get so frustrated when I'm hosting or watching a call-in show and you get a Phil bro come on and they're telling you that this is this, the grounding substrate of being in your worldview is this. That's an automatic fuck off for me. Because first of all, it tells me that they don't really know what they're talking about, because if they did, they wouldn't be throwing all these technical terms out there out the bat. And secondly, they're not interested in an honest conversation, because if they were, they would be exploring the subject, not telling me the conclusion before we've even started.
Well, yeah, that's not a conversation. That's just like they're just giving you a statement and pretending that it is truth. Um, I think that's what I like about philosophy. Um, and I don't think we will ever get rid of philosophy. Like it will never not be necessary, because even though we have science and a lot of scientific methods to come to very good answers about questions that we have, I think philosophy is where we're getting the best questions from, right? Like where people are actually thinking and wondering and having that curiosity. And speaking of curiosity, are there any? I was watching. I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson talking about this. Like he was like, "Well, this question keeps me up at night. Do you have any philosophical questions that keep you up at night about consciousness or whatever, or otherwise?"
They don't just keep me up at night. They plague my life throughout my days, uh, and everything and anything, and that is the honest answer. It is literally everything and anything. I sit and people think I make this up. As I say to people, look, when I don't switch off from doing this, I don't switch off from looking at philosophy or looking at religion or looking at psychology. I do this all the time in one form or another. Even if it's just sat thinking about it, I'm doing this all the time. And I think that's why I probably get so frustrated with people who I perceive, and I may be wrong in a lot of cases, but who I perceive of kind of coming to this with a preconceived notion of something and throwing an answer out there, and that's it. And they're only interested in the other side or another opinion on the matter because they want to shoot it down. Because for me, everything's open. We can look at stuff and we can investigate it, and we don't have to have an answer to it. We don't have to have an answer. It's there for taking. And consciousness is the big one for me. That's my bread and butter, if you like. But all sorts of other questions, especially like regarding the universe, things like that. I've got a big interest in the universe. But all sorts of questions come up. Ethics, questions about war, questions about, I'm going to be commencing an essay very shortly, so I'll not say too much about this.
Okay.
But I'm going to be writing an essay shortly about the ethics of war and
Oh,
what is kind of justifiable. Who is justifiable to kill in war and who is not, if is anybody, all that kind of good meaty stuff. So like anything and everything, I think is open to questioning in philosophy. I think where we need to stop the philosophy is where we have a good scientific basis. Scientific empiricism is without a doubt the best method we have for ascertaining what is likely true. It is the best method we have for advancing us technologically. And I think, although I don't agree with Sam Harris that it answers the question of morality, and I possibly don't agree with Sam Harris that it can answer the question of morality in the future, it certainly gives us a good grounding on that. So there are lots of things in philosophy that I think we can say are pretty redundant, or we don't really need to ask, or we don't need, even if we do need to ask those questions, do we need to spend those time on as much time on them? Asking whether the universe is philosophically contingent or necessary, to me, is a interesting aside to the actual work that's taking place in cosmology and physics. That's much more important to ascertaining what the universe is than asking these philosophical questions. They're interesting. They're certainly legitimate to be asked, but are they at the forefront of that subject? No, not by a long shot. And I think goes for a lot of things in philosophy. We can use it to inform stuff, but let's not use it to make decisions about stuff.
I like that. So, two things that I wanted to touch on what you were just saying. Very interesting what the essay that you're writing about. You say the ethics of war. That's a really interesting topic. Joe and I were watching Saving Private Ryan the other day, and it came to this scene where um, they are trying to safeguard to sort of neutralize this area, and they throw all of these grenades at it, and everything blows up, and they kill pretty much everybody, and there's just one German soldier left, and they walk up to him, and there's one of the American soldiers that speaks German, and so he starts interacting with the German soldier and talking to him, and he's kind of opposed to everybody else wanting to kill him. And Joe and I were talking about whether it was the right thing to do or not, and I think we disagreed a little bit on that. I was like, there are just human beings that were, they were young kids put in that position. I don't think that they should have killed him. And Joe was like, "Well, but they're the enemy, and you gotta kill them." So like, it just made me think of that, like the ethics and the discussions, like sort of philosophical questions that we can ask ourselves about who is it right to kill in war, and exactly in what situation. Like, because that was a very different situation than if you are running into a whole group of people shooting at you. Okay, yeah, you can defend yourself, but this guy was just on his own by himself. He'd been neutralized. He had no more weapons. So it's like, okay, what do you do in that situation? But anyway.
I've got to be very careful on this because, as I say, I am about to commence an essay on it, and
Yeah.
I'm not really supposed to talk about stuff for fear of
Giving it your way,
collaboration
yeah.
and all
Oh
that.
no,
Yeah,
yeah.
so I'm going to be very, very careful. What I will do is I will, which I think I'm safe in doing, is say, let's think back to instances in the Bible where we're talking to Christians, and it's not necessarily the Bible itself that says this. It's more Christians who say this, who are defending it. And they're talking about, for example, the slaughter of the Amalekites, people like that, where they wiped them off the face of the earth, including children. And they say that is justifiable because if we don't do that, those children will grow up and take revenge on us. Now, we're talking about a very, very similar situation to what you and Joe was discussing.
Right.
This
Yeah, that
idea
was one
that
of the fears. Yeah, one of the fears.
the,
It was that he was gonna go back to his people and get more weapons, and
And
yeah.
end up killing more. Yeah.
what I would ask on that in immediately is this a slippery slope argument where where we're kind of projecting too much into what might happen, or is it a legitimate concern? And I think there's some sort of line in there that we can think about.
Yeah, you just have to think about the questions that come along with that. Yeah,
And that's all
good.
I'm going to
All
say
right.
on that subject. I
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
want to
yeah.
get
No, you're good.
myself into trouble.
I don't. Yeah, I don't want to get you into any more
So we're
trouble. So,
giving you to something to think about without getting myself kind of
perfect.
a slap on the wrist.
No, that was perfect. Then I won't ask Joe to ask you questions because he loves the topic of war. So
I
we'll
know.
keep that for after the essay is out. Then we'll talk about it. And so the other thing that I was gonna mention is that, yeah, I completely agree that, so that not everybody likes Sam Harris very much, especially lately with some comments that have come out. But the moral landscape book is pretty brilliant, and it's a pretty good sort of guiding tool that we can use for determining morality and so on and so forth. Like, I will still, that's one hill I will die on, that it is a good book.
It's I'll be honest with you, I've not read it all the way through. I've read little parts of it. I think so. Let's get the personal insults out of the way first before we talk about the work. I think Sam Harris is a very arrogant, very elitist snob. So let's get that out of the way first.
Right.
Because there's nothing better than a good poison of the well before you talk about something. I've not read The Moral Landscape all the way through. I've used it in essays and things in the past that I've written, so I've kind of flicked through and had a broad reading of it and taken what I need to take from it to make particular philosophical points. Uh, my degree's in 3 parts. It's in religious studies, philosophy, and ethics. So, although I very, very rarely talk about ethics on streams and stuff, it is something that you know is something I've studied academically, and is very important. I think the gist of what Sam Harris's point is in that book, other than the aforementioned thing that we can scientifically come up with a solution to the ethical problem, which I'm not entirely convinced of. It's a good point. It's a good gist that morality has these peaks and troughs and things. The good points. It's a good guiding principle, I think I would say. So without kind of getting deeper into the book, I've tried listening to the audio book as well, by the way, read by Sam Harris, and his voice is so dull and uninteresting that it's one of very few audiobooks I've had to turn off before finishing.
Oh
Uh,
wow. Okay.
so I know I'm coming down pretty heavy on the guy now. That's I genuinely do think the general gist of the book, from as I understand it, not having read it
Yeah.
fully and not having understood it fully, more than likely. I think this idea that there are peaks of troughs in morality, which is the general gist of it, it's right, and there isn't this case of just this level landscape of morality, of objectivity, where we can just say this is definitive. I don't think we can ever do that, and I think if we try and do that, we fall into pretty shitty ground. And I think the Bible again is another really, really great example of this, where we've got this supposedly objective morality coming from this being, and what it turns out actually be is just subjective morality, which is based on a mind, and it's not objective at all. It's the same kind of objective as if I'm giving my children a set of instructions and they're saying, well, this is universal. From their perspective, they're looking at these instructions and saying, these instructions are universal, they are objective, when in actual fact, they're not. They're subjective because they're coming from a mind. And I think that's exactly what's happening in Christianity and in Islam and in these traditions that have, objective morality, but it's based on a mind. There's nothing objective about it at all. It's entirely subjective. And I think when we understand that, then these guiding principles that Harris talks about in his book become good guiding principles. I think we can just throw away a lot of the other shit he talks about.
Oh yeah, we can forget that part. Pretend it didn't happen. Yeah, no, but I think his sort of idea, sort of his message is kind of very similar to what you were just talking about. That there is a lot of gray areas, and that we can't um, get to a point of objective morality, even when you look at biblical morality. If you look at just the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, but then we have laws that make it legal or correct to be able to kill, to where you're not persecuted if you killed in self-defense, to where if somebody does a certain thing in certain states, at least here in America, they can get the death penalty. I don't know how it is in the UK, but so it, it makes you realize that while they claim that it is an objective moral to not kill, there are still exceptions that they're making based on our own subjective ideas of what is what is right and wrong.
Yeah, I think the very easiest way to put it, from as I understand it, is that we have subjective morality. Every single thing is subjective. It is down to either the individual or the society. But some things are based on objective facts. So, although we don't have objective morality in and of itself, we do have objective facts that inform morality.
But
So, everybody dies, everybody gets ill. Um, I don't want to sound like I'm reading out the kind of the four principles of Buddhism here, the four noble truths in Buddhism, because that's kind of the first two of those. That everybody dies, everybody gets ill. You know, nobody wants to be hurt. It's we are averse in general. There are exceptions. We are averse in general to being harmed, to feeling pain. And I think when we take those objective facts into account, these do inform subjective morality. And indeed, they can make some subjective moral decisions or opinions seem objective.
no,
You know, for example, killing people. And this is why we universally see kind of laws against killing people. It's not good, as Sam Harris says, for the moral landscape of the society, for the community. So this is why we don't. This is why we universally see it as being a bad thing. It's not that it's objectively bad; it's that there are objective facts that inform it.
yeah, that completely makes sense. Yeah, for sure, and I agree with that. Um, Joe, you have any comments, questions, inquiries for Richard on any of
No,
the topics we talked today?
I've just really enjoyed like the insight on everything we discussed. I mean, it's been just great conversation. I don't
What
really have
about
any
you, Richard?
questions.
Okay, good. What
Yeah.
about you, Richard? Was there anything else that you wanted to bring up or discuss or talk about before we let you go? Because I know I'm sure it's we're
Yeah,
past your
it's
bedtime
like
now by now.
quarter to 1 in the AM here now. Yeah. Look, I always enjoy coming on here and talking to you two, and you know, this conversation has just shown exactly why I enjoy coming on, because we get into these conversations where somebody says something which leads down a completely new rabbit hole and kind of gets us onto a new subject, and I love that. I love that, and yeah, and I think the very important subjects to talk about as well. You know, ethics and philosophy are really, really important. Uh, Knowing consciousness, understanding consciousness is for me, probably, for me personally, the most interesting kind of facet of anything. And I've been, as I said earlier, I've been meditating for over 20 years and exploring that within myself as well as outside of myself academically. And I think it's something that we really, really need to expand. When we're talking about consciousness to the animal kingdom, we need to include those animal experts in that conversation, and broadly having conversations, friendly conversations. We can have these conversations. We could sit here with two or three theists and have this same great dynamic and these same conversations and these same explorations. And I want more of that. I want less of the combative stuff where we're arguing about stuff, and I want us to look at these same guiding principles and explore subjects as they are. And I think that is what we need to move forward. And to get that, we need education. And
Yeah,
education is vitally, vitally, vitally important, because we can't have these good conversations unless we can get the bullshit out of the way first.
Yeah.
When people are anti-vax, anti-evolution, anti-globe. We can't have conversations where when those people are involved in them, because the focus shifts from what it needs to be on, which is an exploration of the subject, to clashing paradigms. And that's not good for any conversation. So we need better education.
Yeah, completely agree. You know, I'm gonna have to make it my mission to find a animal biologist that has some kind of knowledge about consciousness to come on the show, and I'll bring you back with them, and we can all pick at their brain.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a book. I don't think I actually have the physical copy of the book. It's called An Immense World. I think they call the author Ed Young. I'm not entirely sure. I tried contacting him to interview him for my book,
Yeah,
and I couldn't get
look
in
it up.
touch with him. Uh, but that book, An Immense World, is a fantastic book. It really, really does go into into this idea of the umwelt, of this animal bubble, this species specific bubble of perceiving the world in which we live. It's brilliant. It really, really is. I highly recommend anybody read that to get a starter pack, if you like, into this world of animal consciousness.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I looked it up, and it is by Ed Young. Yeah, you're correct about that.
What is the
Yes,
name of the book though? Was it in an
in
immense world, right? That was the name
An
of it.
Immense World, I
Oh,
believe.
okay, okay,
like big
gotcha.
world. Yeah. Um, I think Joe's cousin might be a good person to have, like, as a theist who doesn't consider himself a Christian, just a believer. But like, I think the conversation of consciousness will be fun to have with him, to like see how he perceives consciousness and stuff. I'll talk to him about it. Let's see.
Yeah,
Um,
if anybody wants to watch actually a conversation, because I always have like these arguing conversations with theists. We were talking earlier about the perspective, which is the show I started doing the calling stuff on. I had a conversation with a Christian called Rich Lockhart on one of Ethan. It's on Ethan Michael's channel, and he had this series of atheist versus theist discussions. And I had a conversation with Rich Lockhart on there, who's a theist, a black gay theist. And we had the best conversation. So if anybody wants to see me in conversation with a theist, which isn't just kind of challenging each other and is just a nice, friendly conversation, go and watch that. And this is from like 4 years ago, so it's an older conversation, but it's a really nice, base. In fact, that whole series that Ethan did, really nice base of watching friendly conversations between Christians and atheists.
okay, I think I just found it. Is Rick Lockhart, right? Okay, I'm gonna put it in the chat. Okay, there's the link. Yeah. Yeah, I just looked it up, and real quick before we are gonna end the show, I'm gonna put up super fast this image that we have a store. So if you guys go to ingeniousmatter.com, we have shirts with all of these really cool designs, and then some more. I'm trying to add, aside from t-shirts, I'm gonna add hoodies and mugs and stuff like that. I think currently it only ships within the US just because of the costs. So just so people know. But appreciate the support. So Richard, really awesome conversation today. I always enjoyed having you over, and we always leave with, hey, we got more to talk about. So we'll do several other shows about several other topics, 3 or 4 hours again, as usual, which is
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. They always seem to drag out when I'm on.
No, it's when you're having good conversation, it's
no.
so easy to go 3 hours with no issue at all. So
I
Definitely can.
know, I love it. Like you said at the beginning of the show, is to me it's a lot more valuable, I guess, for myself than the call-in shows, because like the caller picks the topic and then you're kind of forced to talk about whatever. But like here we had a really good kind of chat as if we were sitting at the table or on the couch talking to a friend, and that's what I really enjoy about this. And we can just engage and go down the rabbit holes, whatever they come at. So I love it. Any last words before we end the show?
No, look,
Advice.
if you do want to talk to me, and on the call-in show, I'm hosting Talk Heathen tomorrow.
Oh
Having a
yeah.
British invasion of Talk Heathen tomorrow. Me and John the Sceptic. So if anybody does want to chat to me on any of these subjects, you feel free to give me a call at 1 p.m. Central on there. But other than that, I always enjoy being on your show. I love coming and talking to you too. And we always talk about consciousness. And I'm, like I said at the start, I'm a one-trick pony, and I'm not going to apologize for that. But yeah, if I can come back, I will come back. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, there it is. The Taki then, and it has. I think it has the phone number probably. Let's see. Scroll down a little bit. Okay, I thought it had the phone number for it.
I can tell you
There it
that I
is.
know it off by heart. 151299199242. Or you can use your computer at tiny.cc/call th.
That was perfect. Okay, good thing that you had it memorized for me. All right, yeah, I'm gonna be watching because I love the British takeovers. It was really fun when Emma was on too. Super
Yeah, Emma's
cool.
great. I love Emma. Emma's brilliant. John's brilliant. We always have fun when we do the British episodes.
Maybe you could bring yourself and Emma someday onto my show, and we can talk about other things because I think she's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. I can reach out to Emma on your behalf if you want. If you've not got contact details, I'll get in touch with her.
Oh yeah, I do know that would be awesome. Yeah, I would love to have her and yourself. And on our British takeover will be dream come true. I might just sit here and just listen to you guys talk amongst yourselves. But anyways, thank you so much for coming on, Richard. And I hope it's not too late for you to get some sleep and some rest.
No, I'm
Yeah,
sure I'll
thanks so
manage it.
much.
Um,
I've got an essay on ethics of war to start tomorrow, so I do need some sleep.
oh, good luck with that. Yeah, and the show.
Rest.
So that should be fun. All right, guys. So I will say, Joe, do you have any advice, words of wisdom?
Just be yourself.
Okay.
Keep it
I'll
simple.
yeah, keep it pretty simple. I'll say that um in this conversation of consciousness, we always come to the same conclusion, right? Like we don't have all the answers, and maybe in this lifetime we are not even gonna have these answers um to any of the questions that we have regarding consciousness or otherwise. But is the mystery. Let that mystery of wondering be the curiosity that guides you, that inspires you or guides you to continue exploring and to continue learning. As Richard said, education, education, education is the most important thing. And it makes all of this wonderful journey that we're taking worth it. So thank you guys. Go subscribe to um Sceptic Takeout. Sceptic Takeout. Why do I always mispronounce it?
Because
and
I spell it the wrong way.
okay, I was wondering about that. Is it skeptic or is it like a British thing? I was like, I'm just gonna go with it's British. But yeah. So go subscribe, and we'll see you guys next time. All right, go do the things. Bye.
And bye.